Well, let's come back and talk about a few other things that are both ethical but also practical in nature. I want to talk first of all about the morality of things like suspending, feeding someone through a tube, or even removing their feeding tube. The morality of stopping kidney dialysis. You can get more details in the chapter because I have discussed it there, but let me just share with you a few things. As to feeding tubes, this is something which strikes very close to home for me, because my wife, her condition, her disease is such that in 2001 it was necessary to insert a feeding tube in her, and gradually over the last decade she became less and less able to eat the normal way. So for the last 4 or 5 years, at least she gets all of her food and water through a feeding tube. As you will remember, this was part of the issue in the Terry Schiavo case, and what we heard at that point is that, look, this is a medical procedure and it is not doing any good, and it's understood that if there is some medical process or procedure and it is not doing any good, you're not morally obligated to continue with it. Oh, thank you so much. Oh, that's great. Thanks. Thank you. So, you know, in a case like Terry Schiavo's, where this situation had gone on for quite a while, it appeared that she was being kept alive by tube feedings, and that was making it impossible for her to die, and this was just going to go on indefinitely. And the argument, as I say, was this is medicine and medical treatment, and it isn't succeeding, so it ought to be stopped. Well, what about that? First of all, I want to address the question of whether this is a medical treatment and whether it's doing any good. Now, the assumption, or the basic thing I think that we have to realize, is that everybody, as a basic necessity of life, needs at least 3 things: food, water, and oxygen, right? And those are not medicines, those are basic necessities of life. Now, if in fact food and water are medicine, then I have a question for you. How many of you ate breakfast this morning before you came? Oh, that's good. Did you enjoy your medicine? What's the point? Well, why is it medicine if it's delivered into the stomach through a feeding tube, and it's not medicine if it's delivered to the stomach through your mouth? That's nonsense, isn't it? This is not a medical treatment. This is a delivery of the bare necessities of life. And, oh, by the way, if it is medical treatment, it is accomplishing its goal. The point of tube feeding is not to cure the patient of the disease, but to maintain their biological life, to give them the bare necessities of life. But beyond that, there's something even further that should be said. If it is acceptable morally to stop feeding someone who is fed and hydrated through a feeding tube, then in those cases, why don't you just take a pillow, put it over their face, and suffocate them? I mean, look, if starvation is acceptable, why isn't suffocation easily just as, in fact, an argument could be made that it would be better to suffocate the person than to stop feeding them through a feeding tube. Why? Because if you suffocate them with the pillow, they'll die quicker, and so it will be more humane. Now, hopefully what I've just said sounds outrageous to you. And if it does, then I hope you see why it sounds so outrageous to suggest that it's okay to stop feeding someone through a feeding tube. We're not talking about medicine or a medical procedure. We're talking about the basic necessities of life. And you can die even if you're being fed through a feeding tube. Sadly, my wife's condition is getting worse in spite of being fed, getting water, and getting medicine through a feeding tube. What about kidney dialysis? Well, that takes care of another of the basic necessities of life, removing waste from the body. Now, some people say, wow, at a certain point, you have to go several times a week to get dialysis, and it's a long process. It takes up a good bit of the day, which it does. And what's the point of just continuing? And so they decide, I think I'm just going to stop getting dialysis. And if you do, then the poisons will mount up in your body, and it's going to take between 2 weeks and 3 weeks before you die, but it will kill you. Well, I can understand and appreciate the feeling, the hardship that there is to have to get up real early, get over to the hospital, get hooked up, do the dialysis, and then come home. It's about an 8-hour or 9-hour process to do all of this. Getting up, getting over, getting hooked up, getting dialysis, unhooked, back. And when it's done, you feel pretty lousy for the rest of the day. It's not going to be a very productive day. But it is clear that if you stop dialysis, you are going to die within 2 to 3 weeks. And is it morally acceptable to do that? No, because it is not morally acceptable to take innocent life. And this is taking innocent life. One could, depending on how you want to evaluate it, this is basically passive voluntary euthanasia. In other words, you are withholding a certain kind of treatment so that you can let the person die, and if the person chooses to stop dialysis, then this is happening voluntarily. I think we need to be careful when someone in our church makes that kind of decision or is thinking about it, that we don't just sort of read them the rules, sort of like Moses coming from the mount, down from the mount to deliver the law and then go back up again, and we don't care about their feelings or anything. No, this is not easy to do, and we shouldn't be insensitive to the difficulty that's involved in getting dialysis, but I think we have to lovingly, gently explain the ethics of this, and it is not acceptable to take innocent life. If you're a consequentialist, it would be, because the results would be to relieve you from having to go through with this anymore, which is troublesome. But if you're a non-consequentialist, that's not the basis of ethical decision-making for you. What I think would amaze you, because there was one point where it utterly amazed me, is how many Christian folk would, perhaps even in your churches, would say that if a person's been on dialysis for a long time, they have a lot of different diseases that they're dealing with, et cetera, and it's just so hard to continue doing this, and they know the Lord, they would just as soon stop dialysis and go to be with the Lord. I think we can all understand that and appreciate it. I know of a case, I won't name any names, but I know of a case where someone made that decision. And the time came for the funeral, and what amazed me is that the people in that person's church, no one seemed to think, oh, this was immoral, why didn't someone talk him out of? No. Uniformly, the thought was, well, that was a good decision. And, thankfully he's released from pain and suffering, and he's in the presence of the Lord. And I was shocked because I thought that Christians would know that what was done was euthanasia, and that violates the biblical rule not to take a life, even for merciful, etc. reasons. I probably shouldn't say anything more about this because I'd have to get into details, but I would suggest to you that if you painted the kind of scenario that I mentioned to your congregation and asked them, do you think it would be okay for someone in that condition to stop dialysis? I mean, of course, assuming that they know Christ. I would dare say that a large portion of your congregation would say, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, for me to live as Christ, to die as gain. What's the point? Now, you might have even said that before this week, but that's why it's important to hear the whole story, to start out with something about ethical theory so that you have a basis for making a judgment on what sort of actions or omissions are morally allowed and which ones aren't. Well, let me talk now about some very practical things that I've learned in having to deal with my wife's situation and with nursing homes. And let me first of all address nursing homes. And if you are pastoring, I would suggest whatever the community is that you're in, it would not be a bad idea, especially if you have a lot of older folk in your congregation who might in the foreseeable future need to use a nursing home. I would encourage you some afternoon, maybe it would take a whole day, to go and visit some of the nursing homes in your community. And you'll want to identify which ones take Medicaid, not Medicare, but Medicaid, and which ones don't. Medicare is a health program that is run by the federal government. Medicaid is public aid, financial aid that is available in one form or another in various states. I think it may be referred to in California as Medi-Cal, but I'm not absolutely certain. And if you cannot get some public aid to help you out, then you're going to go into a nursing home or have a relative go into a nursing home on the basis of being a private pay patient. And you need to know what it's going to cost, have some idea of this. We moved my wife into a nursing home in the middle of November of 2007. when we moved in, we were told that they expected the first month's payment and a deposit, which was another month's worth of payment. At that time, her care, she's in a part of this nursing home that has specialized care, but it's not that much more expensive than the other parts of the nursing home. But at that time, it cost $6,800 a month. And in January of 2008, it went up to over $7,200 a month. That's not the Cadillac, so to speak, of nursing homes. That's about average. You can get cheaper ones, but you're probably not going to want to keep anybody there. You can get more expensive ones. But what you should know is this. When I was told what it would cost, I wasn't totally shocked because I had some idea about this and I had done various types of research. And so my immediate question when I was told here's what it's going to cost per month, I said, and what do we get for that? Well, you get a room, not necessarily a private room. You're going to probably have one or maybe two roommates, perhaps more. You're going to get 24-hour skilled nursing care, though the skills of the caregivers differ. There are different levels of caregiver. And you are going to get all the food. Except in my wife's case, because she was on feeding tube, that meant they'd have to do something extra special to be sure that she got fed. And so for her, the food was going to cost more. The amount that we were to pay per month did not include any medications. It didn't include the cost for any physical therapy or any other kind of therapy. If she needed to go to a doctor, it didn't pay for that. If a doctor came in to see her for something, it doesn't pay for that. For a number of years now, especially since she's been in the nursing home, if she needs to go to the doctor or to the hospital for some reason, it is by ambulance, and the nursing home arranges that. That doesn't come in the $6,800, $7,200. So it's expensive, but it doesn't cover everything. You can see, multiply that amount of money times 12 months. You don't have to be a whiz at math to know that your life savings could be gone within 2 or 3 years. And you might say, well, why in the world then would you do this? Or, I mean, aren't there other ways? Well, class, the really sad thing that I found, because I didn't want my wife to move out of our home, I kept her in the home as long as I could care for her needs. If you talk to her neurologist, he'd probably say I should have moved her out 5 to 7 years earlier. But I looked for every possible way to keep my wife in the home. And one of the possible ways, I thought, well, maybe you could hire some caregiving services to come in to take care of her while I'm over at school teaching and doing my responsibilities. And then when I get home, I can take over. Well, the first thing that I found out is that most of the services that will do that won't just do it 1, 2, or 3 days a week. They want to do it the whole week. I mean, because what are they going to do with their workers after they've done this for you 2 or 3 days? And they aren't going to do it for just part of the day. They want to do it the whole morning or the whole afternoon. So if I had a morning class and could come home in the afternoon, they still want to be there. And it was going to cost at that time something like $21, $22 an hour. And they would prefer to do it for a week at a time. And if you do that from, say, 8 a.m. to about 5 p.m., well, do the math. That gets to be pretty expensive. And there is no insurance company, health insurance company, that will pay 1 cent for that. Even though it would be considerably cheaper to do that than for someone to pay to have a patient in a nursing home, no insurance company will pay for caregivers in your home. One of the many things that's problematic about healthcare in the U.S. Well, I looked at other possibilities, and none of them really would have worked. I mean, I thought, well, maybe what we could do, if there's a seminary student whose wife is a nurse, maybe I could give them lodging, for free, and in return they would care for my wife. But you know, who knows? It's going to take some time to interview people. Are you going to fit together well in the house? Is their schedule going to mesh with yours? What if their habit is they don't go to bed till 1 or 2 a.m. and you don't do terribly well in falling asleep, and you need to go to bed much sooner? And, you know, once you bring someone in, you can't just 3 weeks into the semester figure out this isn't working, I'm going to boot them out. That, you know, you might as well forget having any ministry on campus from that point out. You wouldn't want to do that to anyone. But even if it works out really well, maybe you've got a caregiver for 3 years. And then you've got to go through the process over and over again. And this still isn't going to solve the issue of getting her to a doctor when she needs one, or to a hospital. So reluctantly, we had to go in that direction. And there are a lot of people who are going to have to go in the direction of a nursing home. Let me tell you a few things about it. The one where I have her is, I think, a good nursing home. There are better ones, but they don't take Medicaid. So you've got to find a Medicaid facility, unless the person has unlimited funds or would not be unwilling to have their life savings drained away. You're probably going to need to apply for some sort of aid. And not every nursing home takes Medicaid, and there's a good reason. The amount that the government gives for a Medicaid patient is way, way less than it costs to take care of them. So a lot of nursing homes are profit-making organizations. They aren't not-for-profit organizations. So how do you choose? Well, let me just give you a few things to be on the lookout for, and this is why it's good to go and walk through a few. Make sure you're paying attention to what you smell as you're going through the nursing home. That will tell you something about how cleanly things are, what the environment is. Look in some of the rooms and notice how many beds are there. That's going to tell you whether your relative is likely to have one bed, one roommate, or 2 or 3. And also notice the size of the room, as well as how many beds are in it. And you know, it probably wouldn't hurt to ask the nursing or the administrative staff if there is some point where, you know, people have moved out, they've died or whatever, and changes in a patient's location in the nursing home have to be made. Ask the administrators, do you just make those changes, or do you consult the patient's family? And do you take into consideration their wishes? Why do I say that? Well, because for the sake of keeping a full nursing home and using as many beds as possible, they may move your relative around and put them in a room with people who are really obnoxious, and you're not going to have any say about it. I would say look for a nursing home where they're going to include you in that decision making, and you're going to have some say about it. Now, why does it matter how many roommates you're going to have? Well, for several things. The more roommates you've got, when it's cold and flu season or whatever, the more exposure your relative's going to have to these diseases through the other people. And the more roommates you've got, the more traffic there's probably going to be of people coming to see them. And don't assume that people are going to be smart enough to stay away when they're sick or getting something. They'll come anyway if they want. So the crowdedness makes a difference. And don't just look at how many patients are in a room, but whatever the part of the nursing home is that you're looking at, look around and see how many caregivers are there. I went to some nursing homes where it looked like in a particular wing of that nursing home, there were maybe 26 to 28 patients, and I only saw 1 or 2 caregivers. That's not enough. Now, even at really good nursing homes, they're always understaffed. But in some places, it's way, way worse than others. And when you see staff members, take a look on their faces. Look at their body language. I mean, there was one nursing home I looked at where one of the administrators showed me around, and here's how she basically did it. We were walking through the facility. It was kind of like this. Here's the room, and this another section. And that was sort of the body language of any of the other caregivers. What did that tell me? Not only are there too few caregivers, but they're not really excited about being here. So this is probably just a job, and who knows how much attention any specific patient is going to get, regardless of what their needs are. Let me also say this. I think the transition initially would have been easier from my perspective if I had known what I'm going to tell you. So hopefully you'll know this and tell it to people, and it will make things a little bit more smoothly. Things are going to go wrong in a nursing home with your loved one. The idea that because I've moved them into a nursing home where professionals are caring for them, nothing bad is going to happen. Sorry. Things are going to go wrong. If your relative, as my wife does, has a catheter, sometimes it's going to come out. And it's not necessarily going to be her fault or the caregiver's fault. Things happen. Sometimes that happens when you're at home. Sometimes the feeding tube, if you've got one, falls out. And it has to be replaced pretty quickly because to insert it, they had to make an incision in the abdomen, and if it falls out, that incision begins to heal, and if you don't get it replaced, then you're going to have to go back and do the operation all over. And the way the operation is done is they take the tube through your mouth, down your throat, into the stomach, and then they make an incision, and then they pull the end out. And if it falls out, you can replace it from outside, but not if the incision is healed over. You've got to go back and do it over again. So things are going to go wrong occasionally. I think if I were to do this again, I would ask the administrators, what's the turnover rate of personnel? This is a good nursing home where my wife is, and they have some really good caregivers, but much to my dismay, there seems to be a constant turnover. And sometimes it's people who aren't quite so good, and sometimes it's people who are really quite good. I'm thankful that this nursing home where we have her seems pretty capable at identifying good caregivers and hiring them. I don't fully understand why people leave if they're going to go to another nursing home. I mean, it's going to be the same kind of job. And so I've asked some of the people, what is the reason for leaving? And they've said, well, you know, maybe sometime they can make another 5 cents an hour. Maybe it's just to get a different set of patients, so you have a different set of problems. Realize that in some sections of a nursing home, you're going to have patients who are dealing with dementia, and their behavior is sometimes going to be pretty bizarre and unpredictable. And, you know, it's not going to do much good to give them a lecture about how they should act instead, because they're not in control of some of these things. So those are some things I would look for. If there is some way, if, for example, at the nursing home where my wife is, there is a family council. This was started by the families of some of the residents to have a monthly meeting and act sort of as an advocate if they were not happy with the way things were going in the nursing home, be an advocate with the administration. And if you can't get anywhere, there is an ombudsman in your state for medical, and you can appeal. And don't assume that if you use that person, that the medical staff are going to be angry at you, because oftentimes the ombudsman will come in, and rather than just be critical, they'll help the nursing staff to see, and nursing home to see how they can upgrade what they're doing. But if there is some way to get in touch with other families that have patients there, it wouldn't be a bad thing to talk with some of them and say, are you satisfied with the level of care that your relative is giving? And I would also ask this, when things go wrong in the nursing home related to your family member, are you informed about that, or aren't you? And if you see that something has gone wrong or needs to be done, and you bring that to the attention of the staff, are they defensive and argumentative and try to justify what's being done, or say, no, there's no problem? Or do they say, yeah, there's a problem, we've got to take care of that? Now, one of the things I like about the place where my wife is, it's not perfect, but one of the things is when things go wrong, they tell me. And if I see it before they tell me and bring it to their attention, they never deny it. They never try to defend it and say it's okay, and they move pretty quickly to try to rectify it. And that's worth a whole lot. I mean, I oftentimes think it's bad enough having my wife out of the home, and how much worse would it be if she's not getting proper care, and when I bring it to people's attention, instead of doing something about it, they want to argue with me, or they want to defend what's being done and do nothing. That has not been my experience, but don't assume that that's true of every nursing home. If there's some way to talk with families of patients before you move someone in, I would do so and ask them some of those questions. If it's at all possible to talk with some of the caregivers and ask them, are you happy about working conditions, et cetera, et cetera. Because if they're not happy, they're probably not going to be the best caregivers that they could be, and that has implications for your family member. Obviously, you're not going to know exactly what you've got till you move the person in and you start to see how things go. There are some things that are going to be frustrating. In a nursing home, you can see something that needs to be done, tell a caregiver, they get it, but they don't communicate it to the next shift. Or maybe they do write it down in the chart, but the next shift comes in and they don't look through all the patient's charts, so they don't know, and you'll find yourself repeating the same thing to a number of different caregivers, maybe in the course of 1 week. That's not fun, but you've got to be persistent enough. What's at stake is the proper care of your family member. And I think, you know, it's important that we not threaten lawsuits, but I think it is important that you be persistent. Not obnoxiously so, but be persistent when you see that there's a problem. Well, those are certain things about nursing homes. Let me talk about something else that's very practical in this regard. How do you go about paying for this? And how do you get public aid, which is normally going to be called Medicaid? And what I want to share with you next is something that a lot of people do not know, including the people who are social workers at the nursing home where you're going to have your relative. The point is that there's at least 2 different types of Medicaid. And one kind you really do want to get if you can. And the other kind is better than nothing, but not much better. The basic point that I need to make, first of all, about qualifying for Medicaid is that you can't get Medicaid unless you have only $2,000 or less in assets. And so you can file the application, but you have to disclose what the patient's assets are and normally what the spouse's assets are, and all of that is subject to being paid. And if you get that kind of Medicaid, they will pay something, but you will also pay a good bit. You will only be allowed to keep $2,000 of your salary each month. The rest of it is going to have to go to the nursing home. You'll be allowed to keep a car so you can get to work. They won't make you move out of your house. You need a place to live. But you're going to have to pay, as well as the government paying a part of it. And that's better than totally private pay, but it's not going to be easy, especially if you're dealing with a medical condition that's going to last for a long time. And some cases you just don't know. There is another kind of Medicaid which we were able to get, that basically pays for everything. But at this kind of Medicaid, social workers at nursing homes don't always know about it, or if they do know about it, they don't know how to go about getting it. Still, you have to, the patient has to have no more than $2,000 to their name, asset-wise, in order to qualify. If you apply and you have more than $2,000 in assets, you may get a response that says, well, we'll put you on a spend down, which means every asset you have, the patient has over $2,000, has to be spent on the care until you get less than $2,000 in assets to your name, and then Medicaid will kick in. But how do you avoid draining everything you've saved for life by this? Well, thankfully, there are legal ways to do this. I don't know whether some of the law has changed since we did this. I don't think that it has, but you never know what Congress is going to do. The first thing that I should say about this is what makes this a bit complicated is that it involves a combination of federal laws and state laws. And of course, each state has its own laws as to how it handles this. So because it's both federal and state, the government, federal government people don't necessarily know what the rules are in the state, and the people in the state don't necessarily know what the federal rules are. So you've got to get yourself a good lawyer, or perhaps several lawyers. When we went to set up things for durable power of attorney, et cetera, we went to an estate planner lawyer, and we explained the situation with my wife's health, and the lawyer said, here's what you need to do. He said, in a case like this, you should establish a revocable living trust, and you should put all of the assets that either of you have into this revocable living trust. And by the way, one of the advantages of having your estate in living trust is that if you do that when a family member dies or all of them die, you don't have to go through probate in the courts. The estate is handed over to your relatives as you designate in your will. But at any rate, so he said, make this living trust. Don't put it in either of your names exclusively, but they use my name specifically. And then what the lawyer said is that there is a law that's referred to as a look-back law. Have any of you ever heard of this? Okay, well, it's good that I'm telling you about this. Here's what the look-back law says. At the time we did this was 1995, the lawyer said, what you need to do is every asset that is in your wife's name, or your wife's name and yours jointly, you've got to move it out of her name and put it into your name and put it into this trust. That way she will have no assets to her name. And he said, then what you do, this law, federal law says, if you move all the assets out of the person at risk's name, and there's a waiting period that lasts 5 years where you don't have some major catastrophic event that requires moving her out of your home into a nursing home, if you can look back for 5 years, and 5 years ago, that's when you set this up, and now 5 years have passed, and there's been no need to move into a nursing home or whatever, then at that point, the assets of the other spouse, in this case me, are off limits for government. Now, the interesting thing is we did this in 1995, and at that time, this look-back law was required 5 years of waiting. Since then, it's been reduced to 3 years of waiting. Say, well, what would happen if we set this up and 2 years down the road, I needed to move my relative into a nursing home? Well, then they would look back still 3 years, because that's the period. And whatever your assets were 3 years ago from now, well, those would be subject or liable to be used for this, not only the patient's but her spouse. But if you can hold off using a nursing home for the look-back period, which is now 3 years, then when it is time to move them in, then you need to get a lawyer who knows this law, and what they will do is fill out the application for Medicaid, and there will be a page that talks about the wife's assets, and she has none, or at least less than $2,000. And when it comes to the next page where it says husband's or spouse's assets, you can write do not or will not reveal, or, won't give the information, and legally the government can't make you do that. Well, I said, wow, I never knew there was any law like that. I thought that, the law was such that it would drain away all of her assets, and then it would drain away all of my assets. And then maybe when everything was gone and she was still alive, then we could get some public aid. But so this is really good news. I said, is this the best way to protect an estate against a disease of the sort we're dealing with? And the lawyer said, it's the only way. Well, I thought, okay, but then that means she's going to be in a Medicaid facility. So my next question was, well, that sounds good, but what sort of facilities are Medicaid facilities going to be? Are they places you wouldn't put an animal, let alone a family? And the lawyer said, the good news is that some of the places you would choose if you were going to go out and pay for it yourself are Medicaid facilities. Well, when we heard that, my wife and I looked at one another and we said, well, why not do this? We're not breaking the law, we're working within the law. And in the providence of God, with the kind of disease we're dealing with that is slowly degenerative, there has been time. In fact, we did this in 1995. All of the assets that were in her name were moved out, by 1996. And we didn't need to move her into a nursing home until 2007. So whatever the look-back law was, we qualified. Well, it came time, and I went back to the lawyer we had used, and I said, can I get help filling out the application? He said, oh, well, I don't know how you do that. I know the law, but you'll need to get a lawyer who actually fills out the application. And thankfully, through connections of people who knew good lawyers, and again, the leading of the Lord, we eventually got to a lawyer who was incredible. And I remember we made an appointment to see her, and before we did that, before we saw her, we had to fill out about 10 pages of financial information and send it to her, so that before we met with her the first time, she already knew what the financial situation was. And we came in, she was very, very busy, but we came in, she and her legal assistant, and within the first 30 to 45 seconds, I knew I'd come to the right person, because it was like going to national ETS meetings and hearing someone give a paper where they gave you a survey of the whole field, and the person clearly knew what they were talking about. And this was the first time I'd ever had anyone explain to me, how do you do this? And she said, you know, you put down your wife's assets, which are none, and then on the page where it asks for my assets, you say, will not reveal or divulge, and the government can't force you to divulge those. Those are off limits. And then you submit the application. Now, this lawyer was so sharp. You know, we said, well, when are you going to file this? Or I'd better get this done by such and such a time. She said, look, regardless of when you move your wife in, we're not going to file the application until somewhere between the 15th and the end of the month. Why so? Well, her experience of doing this time and time again has been such that what she's learned is that every month there's a certain number of Medicaid applications that are pulled for an audit. That doesn't mean they aren't going to get approved, but they just pull a certain number of them, and so it's going to delay the process. And since that normally happens between the first of the month and the 15th, she's learned to file it at the end of the month, and then it'll be left alone and it'll be acted on more quickly. So, you know, one of the first things that she said when she came in was, well, you're going to have to make a decision before you leave. You're going to have to decide whether you want to hire us to be your lawyer, and if you do, you're going to have to leave a retainer of $3,000, which I wasn't expecting, but I was glad I had my credit cards. You know, I thought, well, what would be the point with everything we've gone through, and this lady clearly knows what would be the point of looking for another lawyer? They probably would be more expensive. She told us she was going to have her legal aid gather the information and expect all kinds of questions and be ready to give all sorts of documents and answers. And thankfully, I keep thorough and extensive records, and you know from having listened to me this week that I also give extensive explanations. So it made the process a lot easier for the legal assistant. And thankfully, the legal assistant hourly wage was less than the lawyer's. So as it turned out, when the whole process was done, the total charges were slightly above the $3,000 retainer, and the lawyer said, forget it, you know, $3,000's enough. And, you know, some people, I guess, are really offended when they're asked to put that retainer down. I said, I'm not. I look at that as an investment. This is a way, what I'm doing is investing in a way to preserve a lifetime of savings so that it doesn't get drained away to this disease. And the lawyer's assistant said, well, that's good that you're looking at it that way. That's the right way to look at it. A lot of people don't see it that way. But at any rate, we spent several months with the legal assistant gathering the information. And class, I got to tell you, they want to know all sorts of things. And one of the first things that people need to do, I figured this out within about a week or so after seeing the lawyer, is you need to establish separate checking accounts for the patient and for the spouse. Because, given that look-back law, if paychecks are coming into the checking account that has in my case, your wife's name on it, well, that's current, and so that's liable to be used for this. And so I realized it would probably be wise to have my paycheck delivered into a checking account that has only my name on it, so that it's clear that that's my money to use for household things. And you say, well, your wife can't have any more than $2,000 to her name. Can you just go and spend her money? No, no, no. Money that she has can only be spent on her care, her needs, etc., etc. So if you want to take a good chunk of her money and pay off a large portion of your mortgage, the government may say, you used your money, you used your wife's money to help you buy your house. See, there's an awful lot of fraud with this, and this is why they ask so many questions. They want to know every check you've written for several years that's $500 or more. They want to know where the money came from that you used, what you're writing it for. Why would they want to know that stuff? Well, there's a lot of fraud here. There's some people who are going to take money and they're going to try to launder it like in a Swiss bank account and say, well, these were legitimate expenses and they've got it stashed someplace else. And then they want the government to pay for Medicaid when they could pay for it. So the government is going to be intrusive, and don't be offended. Well, in the good providence of the Lord and leading us to this lawyer, and her knowing what she was doing, what happened in our case was just unthinkable. My wife moved into the nursing home on November 15th, and within the next week it was Thanksgiving that year. The Monday after Thanksgiving, November 26th, the lawyer sent the Medicaid application from one county to the county in which we live and the nursing home was. And then we waited, and I thought, well, we're not going to hear anything before the holidays are over. People aren't going to be dealing with this. I mean, we may not hear anything till the end of January, middle of February. So much to my surprise, about 5 days before Christmas, I get a call from her nursing home saying, we need to get more food for your wife because she's running out, and she's a Medicaid recipient, and so we need to know what the number is. I said, well, we've applied for Medicaid, but I haven't heard that we've gotten it approved. He said, well, her name is in the computer on it. And I thought, oh, well, that would be great, but I don't know. So in talking about this, the lady at the nursing home said, well, if you like, here's the number, the phone number of the lady in your county who actually would make the decision, and you can give her a call if you want and find out. And lo and behold, I place a call and the lady is there, and I talked with her and she confirmed that, yeah, my wife had been approved, and not only approved for Medicaid, but it was retroactive to the day she moved into the nursing home, which meant the deposit and the first month's rent and everything else that we paid in to get her into the nursing home was returned. And I said, I really thought this might not be acted on until sometime in January or February because of the holidays. And she said, no, we don't do things like that. People are in need. So, well, when actually was this approved? Well, I think she told me December 11th. Which means that between November 26th and December 11th was all the time it took to get this application approved. That's 15 days. That's unheard of. Obviously, the Lord was in that. And the Lord leading you to the right lawyer. It's going to cost something to get the right person to do this, but it surely is worth it. And what the lawyer said is, out of each paycheck, each of my paychecks, I need to take a certain portion. It's not nothing, but it's not the majority of it, and put it aside, because at some point the county is going to come and ask you to pay that, for her care. So I've been expecting that, and after a few months that she was in the nursing home, we hadn't gotten that call, and so I thought, well, let me call this lady who made the decision and ask her when we're going to have to pay it. And I got a hold of her again. She said, oh, well, no, they haven't come. They will come, but normally they don't come until after the patient involved dies. So what I've done, I still take that money out of every paycheck and I put it in a savings account that draws interest, not much nowadays, but it's there. And my lawyer had estimated conservatively how much I should take out of each paycheck. I don't know whether there's actually more in there than they're going to ask for or less, but putting it away paycheck by paycheck is a lot better than having to come up with the whole thing at once. But class, what I can tell you is that this is like the silver bullet, if I can put it that way. For the first 4 or 5 months, when there would be doctor visits or whatever and expenses from hospital, they would send me the bill of what was left over that I needed to pay, and I would call up the doctor's office or the hospital, talk with the business office, and I would say, I want to talk with you about my wife's bill. I said, yes. Are you aware that my wife is a Medicaid recipient? Oh, no, we didn't know that. What's her recipient number? I'd give it to them. They said, fine, we'll take care of it. You don't pay for anything. Outside of the amount I take out of each paycheck, nothing. Nothing is paid. That is a great illustration of grace. And I know that ultimately it's God's grace. Now, here's the reason for telling you this. That is very different than the kind of Medicaid most people get, where both spouses' assets are online. In most cases, you don't have 3 years to prepare for this sort of thing. It just happens. But what I would say to you is, if you have family members who are ill with something and there is a debilitating disease and you think that it might require a nursing home at some point, I would find myself a good elder lawyer. You can look up in the phone book. This is a whole industry that has arisen, elder law. And get someone who really knows what they're doing. It's not going to be cheap, but they don't all cost the same amount. Some of them are less expensive than others. Here, it's good to have people who are lawyers or who are in the healthcare or nursing home business give you some advice of who to talk to. But share this information with them. Get them to set up this revocable living trust and to start moving the assets out of the at-risk spouse's name into the other. And it may go 3 years before you have to do this, move them into a nursing home. It may be less. You can't say. But if you know someone has a condition or is going to have a condition, and you know that there might be that kind of time, this is a way to protect your estate. I don't see this as greed. I see this as good stewardship. What if in your assessment the Lord wants you to leave large portions of your estate after you go to be with the Lord with a Christian organization to help ministry in the future? You can't do that if it's all gone to a nursing home. So this is just common sense. There's one other thing I want to tell you about applying for Medicaid. And this is going to sound crazy, but it is true, and I will explain why it's true. the rules are that you cannot apply, you can't actually file the application for Medicaid of any sort until the person is a resident in the nursing home. The problem is that no reputable nursing home is going to admit you without you making a deposit and first month's rent. You say, that doesn't make any sense. If I can't apply until I'm a resident, well then, and if they won't just let me move in and then file the application, I'm going to have to pay something up front. Yeah, you know why? Because there have been people who've taken advantage of nursing homes. There have been people who've said, we're going to apply for for Medicaid, and they move into the nursing home, and then they do apply for Medicaid, and it gets rejected, and maybe it takes 6 months to a year to process the application and find that out, and all these bills are piling up, and these patients and their families can't pay. And so the nursing home is stuck with it. You say, well, at least they can get the person to move out. No, they can't. Eviction laws are such that it's not easy once a person's a resident in a nursing home to get them out. And so many nursing homes have had that kind of scenario happen where they don't, the patient doesn't get Medicaid, they are still living in the nursing home, and they are not paying for anything, and the nursing home is stuck with the bill. And that's why reputable, decent nursing homes, they've learned the lesson, and they say, we're not going to let you move in and tell us you're going to file the application. You have to at least pay us before you can move in and until you have the Medicaid application approved, if it's going to be. So that's why I had to pay up front a deposit, which was 1 month's rent, and the first month. And, you know, I realized that this process could go on for months, and I'd continue to have to pay. And in the goodness of the Lord, it went really quickly. You know, part of that was due to having a good lawyer who knew what she was doing. But that's the dollars and cents of it. And, you know, I saw I was going to go deeper and deeper into debt to do this, but what was the alternative? The objective is get my wife properly cared for. And if that's what it takes, that's what you do, and you leave it in the Lord's hands, that He's going to work it out. And it worked out in the best possible way it could have. But those things don't happen by chance. You have to take some foresight. You have to do some planning, and you have to execute some of that planning. And I share this with you so that you can know this information for your own sake, but also for the sake of your people. Because they haven't had the advantage of sitting through the last few days of class. They don't know any of this. And they're just going to be overwrought emotionally when there's a crisis that comes. And now that you know a lot of this information, if I were in your shoes, I would feel duty-bound to share that with my congregation, just as I feel duty-bound in teaching this class on ethics this week. You know the book, there's a lot of other topics. But I said, when Dr. Mayu and I talked about this originally, I said, I really think we've got to talk about this because there's a lot of practical things that are going to be faced in ministry, and there's a lot of things that people wouldn't know that aren't in a book that you learn by experience, and I want to share that. So we've done euthanasia. But we should now take a break for about 10 minutes, and then I want to come back and for the rest of the time today, get into the homosexuality issue. Okay, let me take one or two quick questions, and then let's take a break. Yes?
I just want to thank you for sharing all that with
Oh,
us.
you're more
I
than
think we
welcome. Thank
appreciate
you
it.
for being willing to listen. This is, I understand, class, this is not the most pleasant stuff to have to talk about. But my hope is that we've been able to do it in a non-threatening way and in a non-threatening environment, and it is stuff that all of us need to know. I wish I'd learned a lot of this stuff differently, but that wasn't under my control. I'm glad to be able to share it with you and hope that it will help you and your people. Yes?
Oh, my question was about the durable power of the tube.
Mm-hmm.
Is it special things from America, or it's possible to have everywhere in the...
Good question. Is a durable power of attorney only an American thing, or is it international? I don't know. But if I were living in another country, that would be one of the first things I'd find out, especially if I had, someone who was sick. Yeah, I would guess that there's some sort of thing like that, but I don't know. I don't know. Yes?
Stumbling a little bit over the, well, we can use the dialysis machine thing for a minute as an example. It seems that you're saying that we're morally bound because man has invented a machine that will actually take over where your organs have failed. My wife's grandmother died 3 months ago because she decided she was not going to do dialysis anymore.
Yep.
Now, she died because her kidneys no longer function, not because she was not hooked up to this machine.
Yep.
And I think you even make that point in your book somewhere.
Right.
So maybe if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
Does every time man invents a machine to help the body, we're morally obligated to use that?
Good question. The question is, there is this technology, and it appears that because there's this technology, it's sounding like we're obligated morally to use it, whereas if we'd lived earlier in history, we couldn't be obligated because that wasn't available. I guess, and that just seems to sound odd, and I agree. To a certain extent, it does. And I had to think about that a whole lot. But now, remember, it's not just kidney dialysis. It's something like a feeding tube. For the last 4 or 5 years, it really would not be safe to try to feed my wife through her mouth. I'm not sure whether she can swallow. So at a certain point in history, if we had been alive and she had this disease, she would have starved to death. Now, does the fact that she would have starved to death then mean I should starve her to death now? You say, what's the point? Well, the point is you can't turn back the clock. God in His providence has allowed medical technology to come to this point, this stage. And if the technology won't do you any good, if it's futile, then no, I don't think you're morally obligated. But part of what it means to be living and being a believer at this time in history is all the stuff that's here. I mean, if we had lived 200 years ago, there weren't any cars. We would have either had to walk or go by horse or horse and buggy. Does that mean all of you should sell your cars now? No, you recognize that we live at a certain time when the Lord in His providence has allowed this kind of machine, a car, to be invented, and we can see the value of it. Are we morally obligated to use a car? Well, I don't know. You could walk, I suppose, although you're not going to make it to work if you live at a certain distance, but there surely is nothing immoral about using it just because it's new. And if there is an obligation to preserve life and not to take a life, and you know this is a way that you can preserve life, even though at an earlier point in history it wasn't available. Again, I go back to the feeding tube. Would it be morally acceptable for me to stop, to tell the nursing home, stop feeding my wife through the feeding tube because 200 years ago, or even 100 years ago, this technology wouldn't be there. So I couldn't do it. So I'm not morally obligated to do it now. But the point is, I'm living now, not 200 years ago. And my job is to do things that will preserve life, that are within my power to do, and not to do some things that will take life if I can avoid it. And we can use this invention of feeding tube. It's hard to call it technology because it's not really a machine. We can use this to preserve her life. And I think that if using this is not hurting her, and it surely isn't, it's not the cause of her dying, and the kidney dialysis machine is not the cause of someone dying. The failure in the kidneys is the cause of the problem. This is a way to allow them to function. And the fact that it's gone on a certain amount of time, well, that's like the test case we talked about earlier today. If it's wrong to take innocent life, it's wrong to do it whether you do it 3 days after the incident or 30, well, not 30, but let's say 5 years after the incident. So having said all that, I want to say something further. I don't want this to sound unfeeling. I mean, I understand that it's easy to pontificate like this when you're not having to go through the dialysis. I'm being asked to give a moral assessment of a particular situation. That's not the only way I can make an assessment of the situation. I can make an assessment as a human being and as someone who has sympathy and compassion, and I can say, I sure understand from that perspective. It's a tough thing to go on with this, and I can understand. I don't think someone is trying to defy God or break a moral law by doing this. But I think you all would agree there are times when we can do things that are contrary to God's word in ignorance because we don't know that they would be wrong. So that's the point that I would make. And the other point I would make is, remember at the start of this week I said we're probably not going to agree on everything. You may not, having heard what I've said, agree with me. Agreement with the professor is not required to pass the class or even to do well. These are not easy issues. They really, really aren't. And though I think it is wrong to stop kidney dialysis, I'm not going to say that the person who does this is the same sort of horrible person as someone who commits cold-blooded murder or commits suicide. No, I understand that there's a difference in the motivation, in the character, etc., and in the knowledge of what they're doing. But that's the dilemma. Now, we're, Lord willing, tomorrow going to be talking about in vitro fertilization, and a similar question could be asked. 40 years ago, there wasn't this way to have a baby. Now there is. Should we say that because this is not natural and it wasn't around for most of history, that would rule it out now? I don't see why it would. I mean, wouldn't you have to say that open heart surgery would have to be rejected now on the same grounds? See, that's the problem when you start saying, well, it wasn't around, but now it is, so do I have to use it? Now, what I'm not saying is that in vitro fertilization is morally acceptable. What I am saying is that whatever the decision you come to on that, don't reject it on the grounds that it's new or newer. Because most of medicine at one time was new, and now it's routine. And, there's no objection to it. Well, one more, and then we must take a break, or we won't get one.
If you look at, you're making the extension between not taking of life, being equivalent to not letting someone die, how would you further extend that then to that we shouldn't prevent the creation of life? That we should not do anything that would get in the way of creating life, within the confines of marriage, of course, and those things.
I wouldn't go to that extent, because that would, of course, mean that birth control of any form is immoral. And I don't think that that's so. I mean, if you think the only purpose, God intended purpose of sex relations is procreation, then of course you'd have to say any form of birth control would be outlawed. But if you think that there might be other purposes that God intended for sex relations, then you wouldn't come to that conclusion. And realize that if you think that procreation is the only purpose of sex relations, that means that once a woman goes through menopause, she should never have sex again, because it's impossible for her to procreate. Okay, I mean, those are some of the implications.
What about just the principle itself, though, regarding life? If life is a primary consideration in the discussion we've had, would not the creation of life, whatever that implies outside of that, be of paramount importance then?
Well, it is not more important than obeying divine commands. In other words, in principle, it sounds like that's always going to be acceptable, but the question is every way to create life going to be morally acceptable? We know it's valuable to create life, but then we've got to ask, well, let's look at the specific ways that you might have of creating life and see if there's a moral objection. But definitely you don't want to just say, well, since creating new life is a positive thing, that means it's okay to create it any way you want. You've just validated pregnancy as a result of fornication and adultery, right? If the only thing that's valuable is creating new life, then people who aren't married should be encouraged to have children, and people who want to engage in extramarital affairs with the intent of having more children should be encouraged to do so. Well, obviously, those sorts of things are absurd, biblically speaking, so what does that tell us? That tells us that while creating new life is a positive value, it's not a value which is the only valuable thing or value involved, and it doesn't allow you carte blanche to create life in every way possible and in every circumstance and with every means possible. So, yeah, I mean, we talked about hierarchicalism. For me, number one in the hierarchy would be love and obedience to God and worship Him. Number two would be preservation of human life. After that, I'm not ready to say, here's the rest of the hierarchy and you can apply it across the board to everything. I think you have to wait to get into the situation.